A man, dressed as a police officer, forced his way into the house in the dead of night. What happened next was nothing short of terrifying. Within moments, the peaceful home in Dover Heights became the scene of a brutal attack. Inside, Denise Govender was found lying lifeless on the floor, her body bearing the marks of a violent assault. Nearby, her husband was discovered bound and seemingly dazed, claiming to have been overpowered by the intruder. The attacker, as the story goes, vanished into the night, leaving nothing but devastation in his wake. But as investigators began to sift through the details, a series of unsettling questions emerged. How did the intruder manage to enter the house without a sign of forced entry? Why had the neighbors heard nothing? No struggle, no cry for help, no screeching tires? And why, despite the chaos, was there so little evidence left behind to support the story of a violent break-in? Denise Govender was not just any resident of the affluent suburb of Dover Heights, Sydney. She was a pillar of her community. Her life was marked by a remarkable warmth and generosity that endeared her to everyone who knew her. Denise's home was a place of comfort and welcome, where friends and neighbors often found solace. Her strong ties to the community were reflected in the deep relationships she cultivated with those around her. Whether it was a friendly chat with a neighbor or helping out a friend in need, Denise's kindness was a constant in the lives of many. Denise's role as a mother was central to her identity. Her two children, Philip and Tali, were the lights of her life, and she was their source of unwavering love and guidance. To them, Denise was more than just a mother. She was a beacon of hope and strength, the person they could always turn to in times of need. Her nurturing spirit and the emotional support she provided were crucial in shaping their lives. The bond they shared was deep and unbreakable, one built on years of love, trust, and shared experiences. However, beneath the surface of her seemingly perfect life, Denise was facing personal challenges. Her marriage to Aaron Govender, while once filled with promise, had become a source of unhappiness. Those close to Denise were aware of the struggles she faced within her marriage, but few could have anticipated the tragic turn her life would take. Denise had been preparing to embark on a new chapter, looking forward to what the future might hold as she considered stepping away from her troubled relationship. The events of March 9, 1998, seemed ordinary at first. Denise spent the evening with her daughter Tali, a visit that was filled with the usual warmth and affection. Tali later recalled their final moments together, especially the hug they shared before she left, a gesture that would become a poignant memory in the wake of what was to come. It was a quiet night in Dover Heights, with no indication of the horror that would soon unfold. In the early hours of March 10th, at around 2 a.m., the tranquility of the night was shattered. Emergency services were summoned to the Govender residence, responding to a report of a home invasion. What they found upon arrival was a scene of brutality. Denise Govender lay dead, her body showing the unmistakable signs of a violent assault. The severity of the injuries, blunt force trauma to the head, indicated that this was no ordinary break-in. It was a vicious attack with fatal consequences. Amid the chaos, Aaron Govender was discovered at the scene, presenting himself as another victim of the supposed home invasion. He told the authorities that an unknown assailant had entered their home, posing as a police officer. According to Aaron, this intruder had overpowered him, knocking him unconscious and restraining him with cable ties, before turning his attention to Denise. The attacker then allegedly fled the scene in the family's car, a white 1997 Ford Laser sedan. Aaron Govender's account of the night Denise was murdered remained consistent and detailed, which initially lent some credibility to his story. His version of events was compelling enough for the police to act quickly. Alerts were issued for the stolen vehicle, and a search ensued. The car was eventually found 11 days later in Rose Bay, a suburb not far from Dover Heights. The vehicle was abandoned, offering a sliver of hope that it might yield clues to the identity of the supposed intruder. However, the car's recovery only deepened the mystery. Despite thorough forensic analysis, no substantial evidence was found that could point to a suspect. The interior of the vehicle was clean, with no traces of blood or signs of a struggle. The lack of fingerprints or other identifying marks inside the car further frustrated the investigation. The case quickly hit a dead end, largely because of the lack of corroborating evidence. Aaron's story, though consistent, had no external validation. The quiet suburban neighborhood of Dover Heights, known for its safety and tranquility, seemed an unlikely setting for such a violent crime. Neighbors who were questioned by the police reported hearing nothing unusual on the night of the murder. No screams, no sounds of a struggle, not even the noise of a car speeding away. This eerie silence made the home invasion narrative even harder to believe. Moreover, there were no signs of forced entry into the Govender home, which added another layer of complexity to the case. How had the intruder entered without leaving a trace? The absence of a murder weapon also posed a significant challenge. Without the weapon, forensic experts were unable to tie any physical evidence directly to a suspect, further stalling the investigation. The crime scene, while meticulously examined, yielded inconclusive results, leaving detectives with little to work with. In an attempt to gain a clearer understanding of what happened, a coronial inquest was convened between 2005 and 2008. This inquest sought to delve deeper into the circumstances surrounding Denise's death. The findings were grim, yet ambiguous. Denise had died from blunt force head injuries, and these injuries were intentionally inflicted. However, the inquest could not determine who was responsible, ultimately concluding that the cause of death was at the hands of a person or persons unknown. This outcome, while confirming foul play, offered no resolution and left the case in limbo. Despite the passing years, the case was never officially closed. The New South Wales Police kept it open, recognizing that there were still unanswered questions and that justice had not been served. Then, in 2021, the case took a new direction. Detectives knew that solving the case would require not just new leads, but also a critical re-examination of the original narrative provided by Aaron Govender. It was during this period of renewed investigation that detectives began to suspect that the truth behind Denise's death might be far more sinister and close to home than initially believed. This suspicion would eventually lead to a breakthrough, but not before years of painstaking work and frustration for both the investigators and Denise's grieving family. In 2021, the New South Wales Police's Homicide Squad made the decision to take a fresh look at the evidence. Utilizing advancements in forensic technology and re-examining witness statements, with the hope of uncovering something that had been missed during the initial investigation. One of the most important aspects of this renewed investigation was the critical re-examination of Aaron Govender's account of the events on the night of Denise's murder. Detectives began to dissect his narrative with a level of scrutiny that hadn't been applied before. They noticed inconsistencies that had either been missed or dismissed in the initial investigation. For instance, the lack of forced entry, the absence of significant noise that might have alerted neighbors, and the discrepancies in Aaron's description of the supposed intruder all began to raise red flags. The more investigators delved into Aaron's account, the more they began to suspect that the story of a home invasion might have been fabricated. The detectives then began to look at the possibility that the murder was a result of domestic violence, a theory that had not been given full consideration during the earlier stages of the investigation. The re-examination of witness statements, particularly those from neighbors and anyone who had contact with the couple in the days leading up to the murder, became crucial. Investigators sought out any details that might indicate a history of domestic strife, or other factors that could point to Aaron's involvement in the crime. By 2023, the investigation had reached a critical point. The NS Dollar of Government announced a $1 million reward for information leading to the arrest and conviction of Denise's killer. This reward was intended to generate new leads, and it did bring forward some corroborative evidence that further supported the detectives' evolving theory. Ultimately, in August 2024, the culmination of years of renewed investigation led to a critical breakthrough in the Denise Govender case. Aaron Govender, now 81 years old, was arrested at Springwood Police Station, a location he had visited for an unrelated matter. This arrest was the result of painstaking work by the New South Wales Police, who had spent years re-examining evidence, re-interviewing witnesses, and piecing together a narrative that pointed to Aaron as the true perpetrator of Denise's murder. When police confronted Aaron with the evidence they had gathered, the allegations were damning. They accused Aaron of fabricating the entire story of a home invasion to cover up a far more personal and brutal act of violence. The police's theory suggested that the narrative Aaron had maintained for over 2 decades, that an unknown intruder had entered their home, knocked him unconscious, and murdered his wife, was nothing more than a carefully constructed lie. Investigators believed that the real story was one of domestic violence, with Aaron himself responsible for the deadly assault on Denise. Upon his arrest, Aaron was initially denied bail and was set to appear in Penrith local court. The charges against him were serious, and the court proceedings would determine whether the evidence was sufficient to secure a conviction. For Denise's family, the arrest brought a mix of emotions. On one hand, there was relief that justice might finally be served. On the other, there was the painful reality that their father, someone they had trusted and loved, was now accused of being responsible for their mother's death. Denise's children, Philip and Tali, were left to grapple with the dual tragedies of losing their mother and potentially losing their father to a life in prison. Detective Superintendent Danny Doherty, who led the investigation, praised the efforts of both the original and current investigators, acknowledging the long and difficult process that had finally led to this moment. Although the arrest on August 15, 2024, marked a major breakthrough in the long, cold case of Denise Govender's murder, the events that followed surprised many. Despite the serious nature of the charges against him, Aaron was granted bail the very next day, after spending just 1 night in custody. During his appearance at Penrith local court, his defense team, led by Brendan Green, effectively argued for his release. Green contended that the case against Aaron was largely circumstantial, arguing that there had been little new, compelling evidence since the investigation was reopened. He emphasized Aaron's advanced age, 81 years old, along with his various health issues, presenting these as reasons for his release. Green also highlighted Aaron's previous cooperation with law enforcement, noting that Aaron had voluntarily gone to the police station where he was ultimately arrested. These arguments were persuasive enough to convince the magistrate to grant bail, despite the prosecution's concerns about the risk of Aaron fleeing or interfering with the investigation. The conditions imposed on Aaron's bail were stringent. He was required to remain at his residence in Blaxland, surrender his passport to prevent any attempts to leave the country, avoid all airports, and refrain from contacting any prosecution witnesses, including his own children. These conditions were designed to mitigate the risks identified by the prosecution, particularly the concern that Aaron might attempt to influence witnesses or evade justice. However, Aaron's behavior following his release on bail caused a significant stir. As he was escorted by police, he was seen sticking out his tongue and making mocking gestures, actions that many interpreted as a blatant display of contempt towards the legal process and the charges he was facing. This behavior sparked outrage among the community and within law enforcement circles. For Denise's family, who were already grappling with the shock of Aaron's arrest. This added another layer of pain and disbelief. The mocking gestures seemed to mock not just the justice system, but also the suffering of Denise's loved ones. As the case moved forward, both the prosecution and defense prepared for a trial that promised to be lengthy and complex. The prosecution's case, while built on circumstantial evidence, relied heavily on new forensic analyses, re-examined witness testimonies, and the narrative of a staged crime scene. They argued that Aaron's behavior during the original investigation and his subsequent actions were consistent with someone who had something to hide. The defense, on the other hand, aimed to discredit the prosecution's case by highlighting the lack of direct evidence linking Aaron to the crime. They also planned to challenge the credibility of the new forensic evidence, suggesting that the time elapsed since Denise's death might have compromised its reliability. The community and media closely monitored every development, with the trial expected to answer the many lingering questions. Would the evidence hold up in court? Would Aaron maintain his innocence, or would the pressure of the trial lead to a confession or plea deal? And most importantly, how would Denise's family and the wider community reconcile with the potential outcomes of the trial? As the trial date approached, the anticipation and tension surrounding the proceedings continued to build, with everyone awaiting the court's final judgment on a case that had haunted Sydney for over 2 decades. But even as the final judgment loomed, questions remained. Does Aaron's mocking demeanor reveal a man so deeply devoid of remorse that he can flaunt his supposed innocence, even in the face of overwhelming evidence? Is this the behavior of someone who has lived with the weight of his crimes, or is it a chilling indication that he feels nothing at all for what happened to Denise? How does one interpret such cold and calculated actions? Are they the mark of a guilty man or something far more sinister? On September 21, 1996, 15-year-old Danielle Houchins, a bright and spirited teenager from Belgrade, Montana, left her home in the late morning hours. It was a Saturday, a day that started like any other, with the fresh autumn air filling the small town. Danny had plans to visit the Cameron Bridge fishing access site on the Gallatin River, a popular spot for locals, known for its serene beauty and abundant fishing opportunities. She had been there before, familiar with its pathways and the tranquil sound of the flowing river. Danny's departure was uneventful. She told her family she would be back later that day. But as the hours passed, her family grew increasingly concerned. Danny was known to be responsible and would never stay out late without informing someone. By early evening, anxiety had turned into dread. Her family reached out to friends and neighbors, hoping someone had seen her. They combed through places she might have visited but found no trace of her. As the day turned to evening on September 21, 1996, the search for Danny Houchins took on a desperate urgency. What had started as a typical autumn day had spiraled into a nightmare for her family. It was around 9:30 p.m., and Danny's mother, who had initially gone to check the fishing site at Cameron Bridge when Danny didn't return, quickly realized something was terribly wrong when she found her daughter's truck parked near the river. The vehicle was locked, and there was no sign of Danny nearby. The area, usually peaceful and scenic, now seemed ominous under the fading light of day. Word spread quickly among the close-knit community, and soon friends, neighbors, and local authorities joined the search. Flashlights pierced the growing darkness as search parties spread out, calling Danny's name, hoping for any sign of her. As the hours passed, the fear grew more palpable. The river, once a source of recreation and tranquility, became a haunting backdrop. Its gentle flow now seemed to mock the frantic searchers, offering no clues as to what might have happened. The searchers combed the area methodically, moving from the parking lot where her truck was found, along the riverbank, and into the surrounding woods. Every rustle in the bushes, every shadow cast by their flashlights was a potential lead, but each turned up empty. It wasn't until later in the night, under the dim light of a waxing moon, that one of the searchers spotted something in the water, just beyond the reach of the shore. There, in the shallow, slow-moving current, they found Danny's body. She was face down, her clothes damp and clinging to her, partially submerged in the water that had by then grown cold in the night air. The discovery was as heartbreaking as it was horrifying. The hope that had sustained the search was instantly replaced by a deep and devastating sorrow. It was a tragic confirmation of their worst fears. As the news of the discovery spread, the search ended, and the area was secured by law enforcement. Flashlights were replaced by the harsh lights of emergency vehicles as investigators from the Gallatin County Sheriff's Office arrived, beginning the grim task of piecing together what had happened. A full-scale investigation was launched, treating the case as a homicide due to the suspicious circumstances surrounding her drowning. The first hours and days of the investigation were crucial, and the scene at the river offered few immediate answers. Danny's body had been found face down in shallow water, which raised some critical questions. Had she been killed elsewhere, and then placed in the water to stage a drowning, or had the river itself been the site of the crime? An autopsy was performed, revealing that Danny had been sexually assaulted before her death. This detail provided a horrific confirmation. It was no longer a question of whether foul play was involved. It clearly was. The priority now was to identify and apprehend the person responsible for such a heinous act. The initial investigation faced significant challenges, starting with the location itself. The fishing access site, while popular, was also remote and not heavily trafficked, especially during the later hours of the day. This meant that the likelihood of finding eyewitnesses who might have seen Danny with someone was slim. Despite these odds, investigators canvassed the area extensively. They interviewed anyone who had been at the site that day, local residents, and even individuals known to frequent the area regularly. In the course of their inquiries, law enforcement received numerous tips and followed up on various leads. However, these leads often led to dead ends. The difficulty was compounded by the fact that Danny's life had been, by all accounts, typical and uneventful. She had no known enemies, no involvement in activities that might have exposed her to danger. This left investigators with little to go on in terms of a motive. Forensic evidence became the next focal point of the investigation. Authorities collected samples from Danny's body and the surrounding area, hoping that physical evidence might point to her attacker. Hairs found on Danny's body were collected and preserved, alongside other trace evidence. However, the forensic technology of the time was limited. DNA profiling, while possible, was still in its infancy compared to modern capabilities. The DNA evidence collected did not immediately lead to any suspects, as there were no matches in the existing databases. Investigators also took a close look at Danny's truck, which had been found undisturbed near the scene. The fact that the vehicle was locked and showed no signs of forced entry suggested that Danny had likely exited willingly. This raised further questions. Had she met someone she knew? Or had she been approached by a stranger who somehow gained her trust or coerced her? Over the following weeks and months, the investigation struggled to gain momentum. Multiple suspects were interviewed, including individuals known to Danny and others with a history of violence, but none could be conclusively tied to the crime. Alibis were checked and potential motives were explored, but every lead seemed to lead to a dead end. For nearly 3 decades, the case of Danielle "Danny" Houchins remained a haunting cold case, one that frustrated investigators and devastated her family. Despite the best efforts of law enforcement at the time, the limitations of forensic technology in the 1990s meant that the case eventually stalled, with no suspects and no clear path to resolution. However, the advent of new DNA technologies in the 21st century offered a glimmer of hope that the case might one day be solved. By the late 2010s, these techniques had evolved even further with the introduction of genetic genealogy, a method that used DNA to trace family trees and identify suspects through their relatives. In 2019, the Gallatin County Sheriff's Office decided to take another look at Danny's case. By this time, Sheriff Dan Springer had taken office, and he was committed to using every available resource to bring closure to the Houchins family. He recognized that the preserved evidence from Danny's case could potentially be reanalyzed using the latest DNA technology. He also understood that fresh eyes and new perspectives could be crucial in solving the case. To this end, he brought in Tom Elfmont, a retired Los Angeles Police Department officer with extensive experience in cold case investigations, and Sergeant Court Deepweg, a specialist in using DNA technology to solve homicides, from the Newport Beach Police Department. The key to the breakthrough came from 4 hairs that had been collected from Danny's body during the original investigation. While the DNA extracted from these hairs had been insufficient for a match in the 1990s, advances in technology allowed for a more detailed analysis. The hair samples were sent to Astria Forensics in California, where a partial DNA profile was successfully developed. This profile, though still incomplete, was then uploaded to the FBI's Combined DNA Index System, CODIS, but no direct match was found. Undeterred, the investigators turned to genetic genealogy, and it offered a new way to trace the DNA back to a suspect by finding familial connections. The partial DNA profile was sent to Parabon Nanolabs, a Virginia-based company specializing in genetic genealogy. Parabon's genealogists were able to use additional DNA databases to build a family tree that led them to Paul Hutchinson, a 55-year-old man living in Dillon, Montana. Paul Hutchinson had never been on law enforcement's radar. He had no criminal record and had lived a seemingly ordinary life, working as a fisheries biologist for the Bureau of Land Management. At the time of Danny's murder, Hutchinson had been living in Bozeman, where he was enrolled in a graduate program at Montana State University. There was no known connection between him and Danny, which suggested that her murder had been a crime of opportunity, a chance encounter that turned deadly. In July 2024, after identifying Hutchinson as a person of interest, investigators decided to interview him. During the nearly 2-hour interview, Hutchinson's behavior raised significant red flags. He was visibly nervous, sweating profusely, scratching his face, and even chewing on his hand, a clear indication of his discomfort. When shown a photo of Danny, he slumped in his chair, further alarming the investigators. However, he denied any involvement in the crime. The next day, before law enforcement could gather more evidence or take further action, Hutchinson was reported to have taken his own life. In the early morning hours of July 24, 2024, he called the Beaverhead County Sheriff's Office, stating that he needed help before abruptly hanging up. When deputies arrived, they found Hutchinson on the side of the road, dead from a self-inflicted gunshot wound. His sudden death left many questions unanswered, but it also provided a grim confirmation of his involvement in Danny's murder. Following Hutchinson's death, the Gallatin County Sheriff's Office publicly announced that the long unsolved murder of Danielle Houchins had finally been resolved. The use of advanced DNA technology, combined with the relentless dedication of law enforcement, had brought the case to a close. For Danny's family, this news came as a bittersweet conclusion to years of uncertainty and grief. The loss of Danny had left an indelible mark on their lives, a wound that time had never fully healed. The family had lived with the anguish of not knowing who was responsible for the horrific crime and whether justice would ever be served. While they were grateful that the truth had finally been uncovered, The fact that Paul Hutchinson had taken his own life before he could be brought to justice meant that there would be no trial, no opportunity for him to answer for his actions in a court of law. This lack of legal closure was difficult to reconcile with the emotional closure that the identification of Hutchinson provided. It was a seemingly innocent offer, $50 for a quick ride to Los Angeles. For a struggling young mother like Kathy Small, the chance to earn some extra cash might have seemed like a small blessing. But what Kathy didn't know was that this simple proposition would lead her down a path of unimaginable horror. What could possibly go wrong with a quick trip for easy money? Who was the man behind the offer, and what dark secrets did he hold? As Kathy set out that evening, leaving behind her children and the small home she shared with a roommate, she had no idea that she was stepping into the hands of a monster. By the next morning, her life would be brutally taken, leaving behind a trail of questions that would haunt investigators and her family for decades. What really happened on that fateful night in February 1986? How could an ordinary ride turn into a cold case that would baffle detectives for over 30 years? And who was the man who preyed upon this young mother, leaving her family shattered and her children motherless? Kathy Small's life, though seemingly ordinary, was anything but easy. At just 19 years old, she found herself in the demanding role of a mother to 2 young children. Living in Lake Elsinore, California, Kathy was trying to make the best of her situation. Despite the hardships she faced, those who knew her described Kathy as a dedicated and loving mother, someone who always put her children's needs above her own. Her days were filled with the routine tasks of motherhood, caring for her children, managing a household, and likely dreaming of a better future for herself and her kids. Kathy's life took a dark turn on the evening of February 21st, 1986. It was on this night that she made the fateful decision to leave her home, responding to an offer from a man she knew as Bill. He had offered Kathy $50 for a ride to Los Angeles, a sum of money that, for a struggling young mother, might have seemed too good to pass up. Kathy had been living with a roommate for several months, trying to make ends meet, and this opportunity might have appeared as a simple way to earn some quick cash. The events of that night remain haunting. Kathy left her children behind, likely expecting to return shortly. However, her journey with Bill would end in tragedy. The following morning, on February 22, 1986, Kathy's body was discovered in a state that shocked even the most seasoned investigators. She was lying on a street in South Pasadena, wearing only her nightgown, a stark and eerie sight that suggested she had been caught off guard, vulnerable, and unprotected. The brutality of her demise was evident, multiple stab wounds and signs of strangulation. The sheer violence inflicted upon her spoke to a deep-seated rage from her killer. At the time of the discovery, Kathy was just another unidentified victim, recorded as a Jane Doe. The police had little to go on, no identification, no witnesses, and no immediate suspects. The scene provided some evidence, but it wasn't enough to generate any strong leads. The community was left reeling from the discovery of such a violent crime in their midst, and the case quickly became cold, leaving Kathy's family in a state of bewilderment and sorrow. Days later, a breakthrough came in the form of a phone call. Kathy's roommate, who had been following the news, feared the worst when she saw the report of an unidentified woman found in Pasadena. With a heavy heart, she contacted the authorities, suspecting that the victim might be Kathy. This suspicion was confirmed, and Kathy's identity was finally revealed. However, this revelation brought little comfort. While it provided a name to the victim, it did not bring the police any closer to finding her killer. The evidence collected at the scene, though meticulously gathered, led nowhere, and Kathy's family was left devastated, grappling with the reality that her children would grow up without their mother. The loss was profound and far-reaching. Kathy's children, too young to understand the full scope of what had happened, were left motherless, their lives forever altered by the violent act that took their mother away. For over 3 decades, Kathy's slaying remained a cold case. However, in the late 2010s, a surprising and unexpected event led to the reopening of her case, ultimately resulting in the long-sought breakthrough. In October 2019, police were called to investigate the death of a 63-year-old man in Pasadena, California. The man was found deceased in his home, which was situated near the location where Kathy Small's body had been discovered back in 1986. This routine investigation took a dark turn when authorities uncovered disturbing evidence within the man's residence. Among the items found were photographs of women who appeared to have been assaulted and possibly held against their will. These findings immediately raised alarms, suggesting a potential connection to other unsolved crimes in the area. Even more unsettling was the discovery of a newspaper article about Kathy Small's unsolved case among the man's possessions. This peculiar detail prompted the investigators to look more closely at the connection between the deceased man and Kathy Small. Though the DNA collected from this man did not match any of the samples from Kathy's case, the discovery triggered a review of the cold case file, which had been dormant for years. In August 2020, the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department decided to revisit the evidence from Kathy Small's case, leveraging advancements in DNA technology that were unavailable at the time of the original investigation. This decision marked a pivotal moment in the case. Forensic experts meticulously examined the preserved evidence, including the clothing Kathy had been wearing and a sexual assault kit that had been collected but never fully analyzed. The DNA testing revealed something shocking: the presence of DNA from 2 male individuals on Kathy Small's body. One of these DNA profiles was soon identified as belonging to William Suff, a man already notorious for his heinous crimes. Known as the Riverside Prostitute Killer or the Lake Elsinore Killer, Suff had been convicted in the mid-1990s for the slayings of 12 women in Riverside County, California, between 1989 and 1991. He was already on death row, serving his sentence for those brutal killings. With the DNA evidence firmly linking Suff to the case of Kathy Small, the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department moved quickly to question Suff. In August 2020, authorities transported Suff from his prison cell to Los Angeles County for an intense round of interrogations that would ultimately bring to light the horrific details of Kathy Small's final moments. Over the course of 2 days, detectives interrogated Suff for more than 7 hours, probing his memories and eliciting details about the events that led to Kathy Small's death. Initially, Suff was reluctant to talk, but the evidence against him was undeniable. With the weight of the DNA findings pressing on him, Suff began to recount the events of that fateful night in 1986. Suff admitted that he had encountered Kathy Small when she visited his computer repair shop in Riverside County. According to Suff, Kathy had given him her phone number during this visit, and he later contacted her with an offer to take her to Los Angeles for $50. Kathy, likely needing the money, accepted his offer. Suff picked her up that night, and they began the drive toward Los Angeles. During the drive, however, an argument erupted between the two. According to Suff, Kathy accidentally knocked off his glasses during the altercation, which enraged him. In a fit of fury, Suff claimed he lost control, violently stabbing Kathy multiple times before strangling her. He then callously pushed her out of the car, leaving her lifeless body on the street in South Pasadena. The details Suff provided during the interrogation were chillingly consistent with the evidence collected at the crime scene in 1986. The detectives had finally gotten a confession that tied together the tragic story of a young mother's passing with the violent spree of a notorious serial killer. Despite the confession, authorities decided not to pursue additional charges against Suff for Kathy Small's slaying, given that he was already sentenced to death for taking the lives of 12 other women, and considering California's moratorium on capital punishment, prosecuting Suff for Kathy's slaying was deemed unnecessary. This decision, however, did not diminish the significance of the confession for Kathy Small's family, who finally had the answers they had been seeking for more than 3 decades. After years of living in the shadow of unanswered questions, Deanna Larson, Kathy's sister, could finally begin to make peace with the truth of what had happened to her sister on that tragic night in 1986. For Deanna and the rest of Kathy's family, the revelation that Kathy's killer had been brought to justice, albeit in the context of other crimes, was both a relief and a source of profound sorrow. In the days following Suff's confession, the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department held a press conference to publicly announce the resolution of the cold case. During the conference, officials spoke about the relentless pursuit of justice, the advancements in forensic technology that made this resolution possible, and the importance of revisiting cold cases, no matter how much time has passed. For Kathy's family, the press conference was a bittersweet reminder of the pain they had endured, but also a moment of collective closure. Deanna Larson, who had spent most of her life seeking justice for Kathy, expressed her gratitude to the detectives who never gave up on her sister's case. In an emotional statement, she spoke of Kathy's life, her dreams, and the void her death had left in the lives of her children, who had grown up without their mother. Deanna emphasized the importance of remembering Kathy not just as a victim, but as a vibrant, loving individual whose life was tragically cut short. In the end, while nothing could bring Kathy Small back, the resolution of her case brought a measure of peace to her family and served as a beacon of hope for other families still waiting for answers in their own cold cases. But it also left us with unsettling questions. Was justice truly served by not pursuing additional charges against William Suff? Should every victim's case be pursued to the fullest, regardless of the killer's existing sentence? Melissa Patton Wolfenbarger was born on September 9, 1977, in a small community outside of Atlanta, Georgia. She was raised by her parents, Norma and Carl Patton, and grew up alongside her older sister, Tina. Melissa was known for her bubbly personality, kindness, and trusting nature, traits that remained unchanged even as she matured and started her own family. By the time she was 21, Melissa had married her high school sweetheart, Christopher Wolfenbarger. Together, they had 2 children and settled into what seemed to be a typical family life in Atlanta. However, beneath the surface, there were signs of trouble, particularly surrounding Christopher's controlling behavior and history of domestic violence. Despite these challenges, Melissa remained committed to her family, often prioritizing her children's well-being above all else. The last known contact anyone had with Melissa was on Thanksgiving Day, November 26, 1998. She spoke with her mother, Norma, over the phone, discussing holiday plans and the upcoming Christmas season. Melissa expressed her desire to visit her family for the holidays, but after that call, she was never heard from again. As Christmas came and went without any word from Melissa, her family grew increasingly concerned. By January 2000, after months of unanswered calls and failed attempts to locate her, Melissa's family reported her missing. They had hoped that she might have simply needed some time away, but deep down, they feared the worst. Unknown to her family at the time, Melissa's remains had already been discovered months earlier. On April 29, 1999, a passerby had made a horrifying discovery on Avon Avenue in Atlanta, Georgia. A severed human head was found, lying in a wooded area near the street, sparking immediate concern and a police investigation. The discovery was both shocking and perplexing. The remains were in a state that suggested a calculated and deliberate act to conceal the identity of the victim. The head had been severed with precision, and there were no other clues nearby that could immediately assist in identifying the deceased. As the investigation into the gruesome find began, the Atlanta Police Department was faced with a daunting task. Without any immediate leads or missing persons reports that matched the description, the identity of the victim remained a mystery. The case took a further disturbing turn. On June 3, 1999, when additional remains, dismembered limbs, were discovered in another nearby area, these body parts, like the severed head, were carefully dismembered and disposed of in trash bags, suggesting a methodical approach by the perpetrator. Despite the grim nature of the discoveries, the case faced significant challenges from the outset. One such was the delay in identifying Melissa's remains. When her body parts were discovered, the police initially did not connect them to any ongoing missing person cases. This misidentification was partly due to the fact that Melissa wasn't reported missing until January 2000, well over a year after she had last been seen by her family. During this time, her remains lay unidentified in the morgue, and crucial forensic evidence that might have been obtained earlier was lost or degraded. It wasn't until 2003, 4 years after the remains were first found, that forensic testing finally confirmed the identity of the victim as Melissa Wolfenbarger. Another major hurdle was the lack of direct evidence tying anyone to the crime. Although Christopher Wolfenbarger, Melissa's husband, quickly became a person of interest, there was no concrete evidence linking him to the murder. Christopher's behavior following Melissa's disappearance was suspicious. He never reported her missing, moved out of their home with their children shortly after she vanished, and provided inconsistent accounts of her whereabouts. However, without physical evidence or eyewitness testimony, law enforcement officials were unable to press charges. The case was further complicated by the fact that Christopher had a documented history of domestic violence. His violent tendencies and controlling behavior had been well known to those close to the family, but in the absence of definitive proof that he had killed Melissa, he was able to evade justice for years. The lack of a torso, which could have provided critical forensic evidence, also hindered the investigation. Despite these challenges, the case remained open, with periodic reviews and efforts to uncover new leads. After years of uncertainty and frustration, the case of Melissa Wolfenbarger took a significant turn in 2024. For over 2 decades, Melissa's family had lived with the pain of not knowing what had happened to her. The breakthrough finally came with renewed efforts by law enforcement and advancements in forensic technology. In 2021, the Atlanta Police Department assigned the case to Detective Jerian Shepard, who brought a fresh perspective and determination to solve the cold case. Detective Shepard's work, combined with new forensic techniques, allowed investigators to re-examine the evidence with greater precision. This included reanalyzing the dismembered remains and other evidence that had been preserved from the original investigation. One of the pivotal moments in the investigation was the decision to conduct further DNA testing on the remains. This was made possible in part due to the arrest of Melissa's father, Carl Patton, for unrelated crimes. Carl's DNA was entered into the system, which allowed for more accurate comparison and confirmation that the remains discovered in 1999 were indeed those of Melissa. Although Carl was eventually cleared of any involvement in his daughter's death, his arrest indirectly provided the impetus needed to move Melissa's case forward. In August 2024, law enforcement officials finally gathered enough evidence to arrest Christopher Wolfenbarger. The arrest was a long-awaited moment for Melissa's family, who had always believed that Christopher was responsible for her death. On August 7, 2024, police apprehended Christopher at his home in Griffin, Georgia, where he was reportedly hiding in a futile attempt to evade capture. The arrest brought some measure of closure to a case that had haunted the Atlanta community and Melissa's family for years. During a press conference following the arrest, Atlanta police revealed more details about the investigation. They noted that Christopher had never reported Melissa missing, despite her disappearance just after Thanksgiving in 1998. Investigators also highlighted the proximity of the areas where Melissa's remains were found to locations associated with Christopher's work and daily activities in the late 1990s, further implicating him in the crime. The arrest was not just a moment of justice for Melissa's family, but also a stark reminder of the challenges faced by victims of domestic violence. Her mother, Norma, and her sister, Tina, became vocal advocates for victims of domestic violence, using their platform to raise awareness about the dangers of abusive relationships and the importance of early intervention. They also emphasized the need for continued advancements in forensic science and the importance of thorough investigations, even in cases that initially seem unsolvable. Melissa's case, however, was still not over, as the legal proceedings against Christopher would likely unfold in the months and possibly years to come. Nevertheless, the arrest represented a crucial step toward justice for Melissa. As the legal process against Christopher Wolfenbarger continues, the focus will likely shift to ensuring that the evidence gathered is presented effectively in court, and that Melissa's family finally receives the justice they have long sought. For those of you interested in following the case and staying informed about the trial's progress, including any new revelations or outcomes, be sure to stay connected with us as we continue to provide updates on this evolving story. Imagine a trusted member of your community, a woman known for her unwavering kindness, found brutally murdered in her own shop. Who could commit such a heinous act, and why? In the sleepy town of Brownwood, Texas, a crime so violent and senseless left residents reeling. This is the case of Donna May, a 72-year-old woman. Donna was a well-respected and beloved figure in Brownwood. She had lived in the town for many years, contributing to the community through her work at the shoe shop, which was a long-standing family business. The shop itself was a fixture in the downtown area, frequented by locals who relied on Donna May's expertise and friendly service. On that fateful evening, Donna May was alone in the store, as was her routine, preparing to close up for the day. The store's business hours were drawing to an end, and the quiet evening should have marked the conclusion of another ordinary day. However, what transpired next was far from ordinary and would leave a permanent scar on the town. As Donna May went about her closing tasks, an assailant entered the store. It was not unusual for customers to drop by close to closing time, but this visitor had far more sinister intentions. The attack on Donna May was sudden and brutal. In the back room, Donna May was subjected to a horrifying ordeal. She was struck in the head with a blunt object, which fractured her skull. Despite her advanced age, she fought back, but the assailant's assault was relentless. The attacker strangled her using a mop handle, causing severe trauma, but the horror did not end there. Donna May was then sexually assaulted and stabbed multiple times. Her injuries were so severe that she could not survive. After committing this heinous crime, the assailant rifled through the store's cash register, taking whatever money was there before fleeing the scene, leaving Donna May's lifeless body in the storeroom. The store, now eerily silent, bore the grim evidence of the violence that had occurred within its walls. The next morning, when the shop did not open at its usual time, a neighboring store owner grew concerned. It was highly unusual for Donna May to be late, as she was known for her punctuality and reliability. The neighbor decided to check on her, but nothing could have prepared them for what they would find. Upon entering the shop, they discovered the back room in disarray and Donna May's mutilated body lying on the floor. The scene was devastating, and the news of her slaying spread quickly through the town, sending shockwaves through the community. The police were immediately called to the scene, and the investigation into the death of Donna May Inlow began. The crime scene had yielded some physical evidence, including blood samples and hair strands, but forensic technology at the time was limited. The police interviewed numerous people, including locals who had interacted with Donna May in the days leading up to her demise. Despite these efforts, no substantial leads emerged in the early stages of the investigation. One of the most perplexing developments came when the notorious serial killer Henry Lee Lucas confessed to the slaying. Lucas, already in custody for multiple homicides, claimed responsibility for Donna May's death as part of a broader spree of violence. His confession initially seemed plausible to investigators, as Lucas had been known to travel extensively across Texas during his killing spree. However, further investigation revealed inconsistencies in his story. Lucas's confession was ultimately deemed unreliable. It became clear that he had a pattern of falsely confessing to crimes he didn't commit, often as a way to manipulate law enforcement and stay in the spotlight. His involvement in Donna May Inlow's demise was ruled out, but the diversion caused by his confession consumed valuable time and resources. As the investigation continued, the lack of solid evidence and credible witnesses led to frustration and dead ends. The case began to grow cold as months turned into years without an arrest. However, the advancement of forensic science, particularly DNA technology, would eventually breathe new life into the investigation. In 2001, a significant development occurred when investigators decided to revisit the evidence collected at the crime scene. Among the items preserved from the scene were Donna May's pantyhose, which had been carefully stored for years. With the advent of more sophisticated DNA testing methods, authorities saw an opportunity to analyze this evidence in ways that had not been possible in 1981. The pantyhose were submitted for DNA testing, and a genetic profile was developed from the biological material left behind by the attacker. This profile was then entered into the Combined DNA Index System, CODIS, a national database that allows law enforcement agencies to compare DNA profiles with those of known offenders and other crime scene samples. Despite this advancement, the case did not see immediate progress, as no matches were found in the database at that time. Years passed, and the case grew cold once again, but the persistence of investigators, combined with the ever-expanding reach of DNA databases, would eventually yield results. In 2019, almost 4 decades after Donna May's passing, a match was finally identified. The DNA profile from the crime scene matched that of Pablo Figueroa, a man who had been convicted of conspiracy to smuggle illegal aliens and whose DNA had been entered into CODIS as part of his federal conviction. This breakthrough provided the first solid lead in the case in years. Armed with this new evidence, investigators conducted additional testing to confirm the match and began piecing together Figueroa's movements and possible connection to Brownwood in 1981. The results were conclusive. Figueroa was the man responsible for the brutal slaying of Donna May Inlow. With this new evidence, the Brown County District Attorney's Office moved quickly to bring charges against Figueroa. In December 2022, more than 4 decades after the slaying, Figueroa was formally indicted by a Brown County grand jury. The indictment charged him with capital slaying, alleging that he had caused the death of Donna May Inlow by stabbing or puncturing her chest with a knife or sharp object during the commission of robbery, aggravated sexual assault, or burglary. Following the indictment, Figueroa was transferred from federal custody, where he was serving time for his previous conviction, to Brown County, Texas, to face the charges against him. The transfer occurred in September 2023, setting the stage for what many hoped would be the final chapter in the long quest for justice. As Figueroa awaited trial, his legal team began negotiating with prosecutors. Given the overwhelming evidence against him, including the DNA match, Figueroa's defense counsel sought a plea deal to avoid a potential death penalty sentence. After lengthy discussions, an agreement was reached. In early 2024, Pablo Figueroa pleaded guilty to the charges of capital slaying, aggravated sexual assault, and aggravated robbery. As part of the plea deal, he was sentenced to 3 consecutive life terms in prison without the possibility of parole. The deal also included a waiver of present-tensing time credits and any future challenges to the convictions, ensuring that Figueroa would spend the rest of his life behind bars. This resolution brought an end to the decades-long search for justice in the case of Donna May Inlow. While no legal outcome could ever fully undo the pain and loss suffered by her family and the community, the conviction of her killer provided a measure of closure that had been elusive for so many years. The Brownwood community, which had been haunted by this unsolved crime for over 40 years, could finally begin to heal, knowing that justice had been served. William Billy Halper was a man known for his dedication and service to the community as a firefighter in South Florida. At just 28 years old, he had already made a name for himself in the local community, not only for his work in public service, but also for his passion for bodybuilding. Billy was a regular at the Apollo Gym and Fitness Center, a well-known establishment in Hollywood, Florida, where many of the area's firefighters, paramedics, and police officers would train. The Apollo Gym, which opened in 1980, quickly became the go-to spot for serious bodybuilders. It was a place where the disciplined and determined would gather to push their physical limits. But beneath the surface, the gym harbored a darker side. Over time, it became a haven not just for those committed to fitness, but also for individuals involved in criminal activities, including drug dealing. The gym's reputation, once built on the sweat and effort of its members, began to tarnish as it attracted more nefarious characters. Billy Halper, despite his clean and respectable image, was caught in the orbit of this environment. On October 21, 1986, the life of this young firefighter came to a brutal end. He was found slain in his own home in Miramar, Florida, a scene so gruesome that it shocked even the most seasoned investigators. Billy had been beaten severely, stabbed multiple times, and strangled. His throat was slashed from ear to ear, indicating a level of violence and intent that suggested a deeply personal or symbolic act. In the days and weeks following the crime, the community was left reeling. Billy was well liked and respected, making his violent death all the more perplexing. The investigation into his demise was immediate, but it quickly became clear that solving this case would not be straightforward. The crime scene offered few clear leads. There was no sign of forced entry into Billy's home, which suggested that he might have known his assailant or assailants. This raised the possibility that the slaying was not a random act of violence, but rather a targeted attack, possibly motivated by a personal vendetta or an issue connected to Billy's life outside of his work as a firefighter. One of the first theories the investigators considered was that Billy's involvement in bodybuilding and his connections to the Apollo Gym might have played a role in his death. While its opening, the Apollo Gym was initially advertised as the ultimate exercising facility in the country, attracting a diverse mix of fitness enthusiasts, including police officers, firefighters, and paramedics. However, it wasn't long before the gym developed a reputation for harboring individuals involved in illegal activities, particularly drug dealing. Therefore, the gym became a focal point in the investigation. Nevertheless, the gym's mixed clientele, which included both upstanding citizens and those involved in criminal enterprises, complicated matters. It was difficult to determine who among the gym's patrons might have had a motive to kill Billy. As detectives delved deeper, they discovered that the Apollo Gym had ties to organized crime, particularly through its owner, Gilbert Fernandez Jr., a former Miami-Dade police officer. Fernandez, known for his bodybuilding prowess and connections to the criminal underworld, was a figure of interest. However, there was no direct evidence linking him to Billy's demise, and Fernandez himself was later convicted of unrelated slayings, leaving the investigators without a clear suspect in Halpern's case. The investigation was further hampered by a lack of eyewitnesses or concrete forensic evidence that could be used to build a case. In 1986, forensic technology was not as advanced as it is today, and the DNA evidence available from the crime scene could not be fully utilized. The police followed various leads, including tips from the public and interviews with those close to Billy, but each potential breakthrough seemed to lead to a dead end. For more than 3 decades, the case of William Billy Halpern's slaying remained unsolved, relegated to the cold case files of the Miramar Police Department. The passage of time, however, did not erase the memory of Billy's brutal death from the minds of his family or the dedicated officers who had once worked the case. Advances in forensic technology and a renewed commitment to solving cold cases eventually led to the reopening of Billy Halpern's case in 2023. The renewed investigation began when Miramar cold case detective Danny Smith took a fresh look at the evidence. Smith was part of a new generation of detectives, trained in the latest investigative techniques and driven by a determination to solve cases that had long been forgotten. The first step in reopening the Halpern case was a thorough re-examination of the original evidence, including crime scene photographs, autopsy reports, and witness statements. But it was the advent of new forensic technologies, particularly advancements in DNA analysis, that would prove to be the game changer. In the years since Billy's passing, DNA technology had evolved significantly, allowing investigators to analyze samples that would have been considered too small or degraded in the 1980s. Smith and his team sent several pieces of evidence, including items collected from the crime scene, for DNA testing. The results provided a crucial breakthrough: a match to DNA found at the scene of another, eerily similar, double slaying that had occurred around the same time in Tamarack, Florida. These slayings in Tamarack had remained unsolved, but the DNA evidence linked it to a man named Harry Collier, a figure connected to the same shady circles that frequented the Apollo gym. Collier, who had been involved in various criminal activities, was known for his violent tendencies. Unfortunately, Collier himself had been slain in the years following Billy's death, preventing law enforcement from questioning him or bringing him to trial. This connection between the two cases reignited the investigation into Billy's slaying. Detectives began to piece together a possible scenario that Billy, perhaps unwittingly, had become entangled in a dangerous web of criminal activity centered around the Apollo gym. Whether Billy was targeted because of something he knew, something he saw, or simply because he was in the wrong place at the wrong time, was still unclear. But what was now evident was that his slaying was likely not an isolated incident, but part of a larger pattern of violence linked to the gym's criminal underworld. Detective Smith and his team, with this new information in hand, held a press conference in January 2024. They announced the reopening of the case and appealed to the public for any additional information that might help bring the remaining perpetrators to justice. The Halpern family, particularly Billy's sister Lori, spoke at the event, urging anyone with knowledge of the case to come forward. By June 2024, Detective Smith held another press conference. Concluding the cold case once and for all, he revealed that while they could not prosecute Collier due to his death, they were confident that he was directly involved in Billy's slaying. This announcement provided some measure of closure to Billy's family, particularly his sister Lori, who had been advocating for justice for nearly 4 decades. Yet, despite this resolution, a crucial question remains unanswered. Was Billy Halpern targeted because of something he knew, something he saw, or was he merely in the wrong place at the wrong time? These lingering doubts continue to cast a shadow over the case. We may never know the full truth, but what do you think? Could it be that Billy stumbled upon something too dangerous to ignore? Or was he an innocent caught in the crosshairs of a violent world? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your perspective could shed light on this enduring mystery. The night of December 19, 2004, in Hamilton, Ohio, was like any other at the Roundhouse Bar, a popular local establishment known for its lively atmosphere. Among the patrons that night was Benjamin Becerra, a 25-year-old known to frequent the bar. Becerra had been involved in a previous barroom brawl at the same location weeks earlier, an event that seemed to foreshadow the tragic events to come. On this particular night, tensions flared again when Becerra found himself in a confrontation with another patron, Antonio El Diablo Riano. Riano, who had a reputation for his temper and had been involved in previous altercations, was not a stranger to conflict. The initial argument between Becerra and Riano began inside the bar, drawing the attention of other patrons and the bartender. The bartender, hoping to de-escalate the situation, intervened and insisted that the two men take their argument outside. Reluctantly, they complied, stepping out into the cold Ohio night. Moments later, the quiet was shattered by the sound of gunfire. Witnesses inside the bar rushed outside to find Becerra lying face down on the sidewalk, a bullet wound in his face, his life tragically cut short. Riano, the alleged shooter, fled the scene in his van. Surveillance cameras captured his hasty departure, and police quickly began piecing together the events leading up to the shooting. Witnesses who were present at the bar that night described the confrontation in detail. According to their accounts, the argument began inside the bar and escalated when both men were instructed to take it outside by the bartender. Within minutes of stepping outside, the argument turned deadly as gunshots rang out, leaving Becerra fatally wounded on the sidewalk. Further investigation revealed that Riano had been seen purchasing bullets at a local Walmart just hours before the shooting. This discovery added a premeditated element to the crime, suggesting that Riano had intended to use the bullets that night. The receipt from the purchase, along with the surveillance footage from the store, provided irrefutable evidence linking Riano to the crime. 10 days after the murder, law enforcement officers executed a search warrant at Riano's Hamilton home. During the search, they discovered the murder weapon, a handgun, hidden in a secret compartment under the kitchen floor. The gun, which still had rounds in the chamber, matched the bullets purchased at Walmart, further solidifying the case against Riano. Detective Mark Henson, who was leading the investigation, noted that all the evidence pointed directly to Riano as the shooter. With that being the case, law enforcement swiftly moved to charge him with first-degree murder. However, Riano evaded capture by fleeing Ohio. Initially, he sought refuge with his sister in New Jersey before making his way to Oaxaca, Mexico. This marked the beginning of a 2-decade-long manhunt that spanned multiple countries and involved numerous law enforcement agencies. In the early days following the murder, Riano's whereabouts were a mystery. Despite being profiled on the popular TV show America's Most Wanted in 2005, which brought national attention to the case, leads remained scarce. Riano had effectively disappeared, leaving behind a trail that quickly went cold. Detective Mark Henson and his team continued their efforts, but the lack of new information hampered progress. Riano's ability to elude capture showcased his cunning and resourcefulness. It wasn't until 2024 that a renewed effort by Paul Newton, a former detective who had transitioned to working with the Butler County Prosecutor's Office, reignited the search for Riano. Newton utilized modern technology and online databases to trace Riano's steps. His persistence paid off when he discovered that Riano was living in Zapotitlan Palmas, Oaxaca, under an assumed identity. Newton's breakthrough came when he found that Riano was working as a police officer in the small Mexican town. This revelation was both shocking and ironic. Riano, a wanted fugitive, was enforcing the law in another country. Newton described his reaction upon discovering Riano's new life. "I'm like, my God, there he is. A little bit grayer, a little bit older, but it was him." On August 1st, 2024, a coordinated effort involving the U.S. Marshals, the Butler County Prosecutor's Office, the U.S. Department of Justice, the American Consulate, and Mexican authorities led to Riano's arrest. The arrest was executed seamlessly, with Riano taken into custody without incident while he was in uniform. Riano was swiftly transported to Mexico City, where he was handed over to U.S. Marshals. From there, he was flown back to Cincinnati and transported to the Butler County Jail. The arrest of Riano was a significant moment for the investigators who had worked tirelessly on the case. Detective Mark Henson expressed a sense of closure, noting that all the evidence they had gathered over the years had finally led to this moment. Upon his return to Ohio, Riano faced the legal system that had been waiting for his capture since 2005. He was formally charged with first-degree murder and pleaded not guilty in Butler County Court. Judge Michael Oster Jr. ordered that Riano be held without bond, citing the severity of the charges and the lengthy period during which Riano had evaded capture. His next court hearing was scheduled for August 12, 2024. Do you think Riano will be found guilty? What are your thoughts on his life as a police officer while being a fugitive? Share your insights in the comments below. On the evening of August 3, 1986, the vibrant Parade of Boats Festival was in full swing in Golden Meadow, Louisiana. This annual event, marking the start of the shrimping season, attracted locals and visitors alike with its colorful displays and festive atmosphere. Among the attendees was 22-year-old Paula Budro, a young mother known for her friendly demeanor and close ties to her family. Paula was born and raised in Golden Meadow, a small town where everyone knew each other. As a young mother, she was devoted to her 4-year-old son, Eric, who was the center of her world. Her friendly and warm personality made her a beloved figure in the community. Known for her loyalty and dedication to her family, Paula often spent her time with her parents and siblings, strengthening the already tight-knit bonds. Despite the challenges of motherhood at a young age, Paula managed to balance her responsibilities with an active social life. She was often seen participating in community events and gatherings, bringing her infectious energy and positivity wherever she went. Her determination to provide a good future for her son was evident in everything she did, and she was admired for her resilience and strength. Paula spent the evening of the festival enjoying the festivities before being dropped off at her parents' home later that night. She was last seen by her family around 10:30 p.m. Unbeknownst to them, this would be the last time they saw her alive. Paula's disappearance was initially met with confusion and growing concern. When she failed to make contact or return home, her family reported her missing on August 6th, sparking a frantic search effort. The small community of Golden Meadow rallied together, with friends, neighbors, and local authorities combing the area for any sign of Paula. Despite their efforts, days turned into weeks, and there was no trace of the young mother. The search for Paula Budro extended over 3 agonizing years with no significant leads. Then, in January 1989, a critical development occurred. Hunters exploring a remote, marshy area near Slidell, Louisiana, stumbled upon skeletal remains. The discovery was over 100 miles from Golden Meadow, where Paula had disappeared, adding to the mystery of how she ended up so far from home. Initially, the remains could not be identified. The technology available at the time limited the investigators' ability to make a definitive connection to Paula. The skeletal remains were sent to the St. Tammany Parish Coroner's Office, but without a clear identification, the case went cold again. For years, the remains were logged as an unidentified person, and Paula's family was left without answers. In 2022, a breakthrough came with advancements in forensic science. The St. Tammany Parish Coroner's Office revisited the unidentified remains, this time with the assistance of the LSU Forensic Anthropology and Computer Enhancement Services FACES lab. The lab was able to render a possible image of the victim's face using the skeletal remains. This new image was circulated, hoping it would lead to a breakthrough. In October 2022, an anonymous tipster provided a crucial piece of information: a possible identification of the remains as Paula Budro. This tip prompted the La Fourche Parish Sheriff's Office to collect DNA evidence from one of Paula's surviving relatives. The DNA sample was analyzed, and in January 2023, it was confirmed that the remains were indeed those of Paula Budro. Armed with this new information, the La Fourche Parish Sheriff's Office reopened the investigation, determined to uncover the truth behind Paula's disappearance and death. Detectives began by meticulously reviewing all previous case notes and leads. They re-interviewed surviving friends and family members and scrutinized individuals who had been in Paula's life around the time of her disappearance. This comprehensive review soon led them to Russell Lee and Judith Weiser, formerly Judith Lee, who were already known to the investigators from earlier inquiries. Russell Lee, who had a history of violent criminal behavior, had been romantically involved with Paula Budro at the time of her disappearance. Judith Weiser, then his wife, was also implicated. The investigation revealed a complex web of relationships and motives. Detectives uncovered statements and evidence that pointed to a deadly love triangle involving Paula, Russell, and Judith. Russell Lee's criminal past was extensive, including charges of aggravated kidnapping, assault, battery, burglary, and arson. His propensity for violence added a sinister dimension to the investigation. Detectives concluded that both Lee and Weiser had compelling motives and the means to carry out the crime. The investigation further revealed that Paula had likely been slain, dismembered, and her remains disposed of in the marshy area near Slidell. This gruesome discovery underscored the brutality of the crime and the lengths to which the perpetrators had gone to cover their tracks. Investigators believed that the slaying and disposal of Paula's body were acts driven by rage and jealousy, a tragic end to a promising young life. With the evidence in hand, the La Fourche Parish Sheriff's Office sought and obtained arrest warrants for both Lee and Weiser. In July 2024, law enforcement officials traveled to Missouri and Tennessee to apprehend the suspects. Russell Lee, now with an extensive and violent criminal record, was taken into custody in Missouri on July 9, 2024. The Mountain Grove Police Department assisted in his arrest, ensuring that the dangerous suspect was apprehended without incident. The very next day, on July 10th, Judith Weiser was arrested in Tennessee with the help of the Cumberland County Sheriff's Office. The coordinated efforts of law enforcement across state lines were crucial in securing the arrests of both suspects. Both Lee and Weiser were charged with second-degree slaying and obstruction of justice. These charges were a culmination of the extensive investigation that had pieced together their involvement in Paula's tragic death. The charges reflected the severity of their alleged actions, the premeditated slaying of Paula Budro, the dismemberment of her body, and the disposal of her remains in a remote area to evade detection. The suspects were transported back to Louisiana, where they were booked into the La Fourche Parish Correctional Complex. Bail was set at $1.1 million each, a clear indication of the gravity of the charges and the potential flight risk posed by the suspects. The arrests were a pivotal moment for Paula's family and the Golden Meadow community. For decades, they had lived with unanswered questions and a lingering sense of injustice. While they were grateful that justice was finally within reach, the pain of her loss was rekindled with each new revelation. As the case progressed, new evidence continued to surface. Investigators recovered potential blood evidence in locations connected to the suspects, including a kitchen and a bathroom. This evidence was submitted for further analysis, potentially providing crucial forensic links between the crime scene and the suspects. These discoveries underscored the thorough and methodical approach taken by the La Fourche Parish Sheriff's Office in ensuring that all aspects of the case were meticulously examined. In the midst of these developments, Paula's distant relative, Michelle Chouest, whose DNA helped identify Paula's remains, expressed her emotional response to the breakthroughs. She articulated a sense of closure, tempered by the grief of what Paula endured. Paula's brother, who had spent years advocating for the case to remain open and in the public eye, expressed a profound sense of relief mingled with anguish. He had lived with the burden of uncertainty and the desperate hope for answers. The identification and the subsequent arrests provided a measure of closure, but also reopened old wounds. He remarked on the bittersweet nature of the breakthrough, grateful for the progress yet deeply mourning his sister's tragic fate. With that being said, the legal proceedings against Russell Lee and Judith Weiser are being unfolded, with the community and Paula's family closely watching each step. The court cases were expected to shed more light on the details of Paula's last moments, the motives behind the crime, and the extent of the suspect's involvement. As the wheels of justice turned, there was a collective hope that the full truth would finally emerge, providing a complete picture of what happened to Paula Budro. On June 26, 1965, the peaceful town of Logan, Utah, was shattered by a horrifying discovery. Tanya Weber, a 17-year-old senior at Logan High School, was found brutally murdered. Tanya's lifeless body was discovered partially nude and hidden in bushes near her home on West Center Street. The young girl had been strangled, and her tragic death sent shockwaves through the community. Tanya Weber was known to be a bright and promising student. Her sudden and violent death left her family and friends devastated. The Logan Police Department quickly launched an intensive investigation to find her killer. They conducted interviews with around 1,000 individuals, collecting statements from 150 of them. The local authorities worked tirelessly, sifting through every piece of evidence they could find. One of the most significant pieces of evidence collected was Tanya's clothing. Investigators meticulously documented and preserved her garments, including her shoes and underwear, with the hope that they might yield clues to her assailant. Despite their efforts, the case would remain unsolved for decades, becoming one of Utah's oldest cold cases. The town of Logan, known for its tranquility and close-knit community, was now gripped by fear and uncertainty. As days turned into weeks and weeks into years, the question remained: who killed Tanya Weber and why? In the early days of the investigation, the Logan Police Department's relentless efforts led them to a key suspect, Owen Hodges Kimball. Kimball, a 26-year-old man, lived near Tanya Weber and was known to her. This proximity and familiarity made him an immediate person of interest. Several days into the investigation, statements from multiple witnesses placed Kimball in the vicinity of the crime scene around the time of Tanya's murder. The police collected substantial circumstantial evidence linking him to the crime. Investigators discovered notes in Kimball's home where he had circled Tanya's name and photograph, suggesting a possible obsession or infatuation with her. Despite these leads, the case took a tragic turn when Kimball was reported missing by his family on June 30, 1965. Shortly thereafter, law enforcement found his body in his vehicle in Logan Canyon. His death was ruled a suicide by carbon monoxide poisoning. With Kimball's death, the investigation hit a major roadblock. The Cache County attorney at the time, B.H. Harris, stated there was no further evidence to pursue additional suspects, effectively leaving the case unresolved. The sudden demise of the primary suspect and the lack of direct evidence left the community and investigators at an impasse. Kimball's death by suicide meant that no further questioning or investigation into his potential motives could be conducted. For decades, the murder of Tanya Weber remained a painful mystery. However, in 2022, advancements in DNA technology and a renewed commitment to solving cold cases breathed new life into the investigation. With the assistance of the Sexual Assault Kit Initiative, SAKI grant, Logan Police Department reopened the case. The investigative team decided to re-examine the physical evidence collected in 1965, particularly Tanya's clothing. They sent these items to the Utah State Crime Lab for DNA analysis. The results were groundbreaking. DNA from multiple males was found on her clothing, suggesting that the case warranted further scrutiny. Recognizing the significance of these findings, investigators sought and obtained an ex parte order to exhume the remains of Owen Hodges Kimball. On November 2, 2023, Kimball's body was exhumed to collect DNA samples from his bones and muscle tissue. These samples were then analyzed by the Utah State Crime Lab and an independent lab, Bode Technology Group in Virginia. The DNA analysis conclusively matched Kimball's DNA to the DNA found on Tanya's clothing. This critical piece of evidence provided the definitive link that had eluded investigators for nearly 6 decades. Therefore, upon reviewing the new DNA evidence and the numerous statements collected during the initial investigation, authorities were able to confirm that Owen Hodges Kimball was indeed the person who killed Tanya Weber. This breakthrough marked a significant milestone in the case. The police department, working in conjunction with the Cache County Attorney's Office, stated that the evidence gathered was sufficient to obtain a verdict beyond a reasonable doubt if the case had gone to trial. This revelation provided long-awaited closure to Tanya's family, who had endured nearly 60 years of uncertainty and grief. Tanya's brother, Stephen Weber, who was just 10 years old when his sister was killed, expressed a mixture of relief and sadness upon learning the case was solved. He described the emotional weight lifted from their family, acknowledging that while the pain of losing Tanya would never fully dissipate, knowing the truth provided a measure of peace. Stephen, along with his siblings, had endured decades of unanswered questions and lingering doubts. The resolution affirmed what they had long suspected about Kimball's involvement. Lieutenant Lemuel Earle, one of the original investigators, reflected on the case with a sense of fulfillment. Retired for 24 years, Earle had never forgotten the meticulous work he and his team undertook in 1965. The preservation of evidence through detailed documentation and careful handling proved crucial decades later, when DNA technology advanced enough to re-examine the case. The dedication of the investigators, both past and present, highlighted the importance of perseverance in seeking justice. For the community of Logan, the resolution of this cold case was a reminder of the strength and resilience of their collective spirit. It reinforced the importance of community support in times of tragedy and the enduring hope for justice, no matter how long it takes. The final closure of Tanya Weber's case not only honored her memory, but also reaffirmed the resolve of law enforcement agencies to continue seeking justice for all victims, regardless of how much time has passed. On December 24, 1991, in the tranquil and remote area of Punadana, Ireland, a 23-year-old visitor from Virginia was enjoying a bike ride when she suddenly vanished. Her absence was quickly noticed and a search ensued. Hours later, Dana was discovered in a remote, overgrown area along a fishing trail. She was barely alive, having suffered severe injuries from a brutal assault. Her body was bloodied and battered, and she had clearly been subjected to a horrific beating and sexual assault. Her mangled bicycle was found several miles away, suggesting that she had been struck by a vehicle and then abducted. The brutality of the crime shocked the local community and drew national attention. Dana Ireland was not just a visitor. She was the embodiment of a safe and serene vacation that turned into a nightmare. The intense pressure to solve the case came not only from the community, but also from Dana's grieving family and the wider public. But there were no witnesses, and the remote location of the crime scene offered little in the way of forensic evidence, casting a long shadow over the island of Hawaii. Despite immediate efforts to find the perpetrator, the case quickly went cold. However, in 1994, a potential break in the case emerged. This development came from John Gonsalves, who was seeking to reduce his own legal troubles. Gonsalves claimed that his half-brother, Frank Pauling Jr., had information about Dana's case. This led to Pauling, who was already incarcerated on unrelated charges, providing a series of statements to the police. Pauling initially claimed that he had been in a car with two other men, Ian Schweitzer and Sean Schweitzer, on the night of the crime. He alleged that they had run into Dana with their vehicle, abducted her, and then committed the brutal assault. However, his statements were riddled with inconsistencies and changed multiple times. Despite this, Pauling's claims were taken seriously by the authorities, given the lack of other leads in the case. In May 1994, Pauling made a confession, which he later recanted, stating that he had been pressured and that his statements were fabricated in hopes of receiving leniency for himself and his half-brother. Despite the recantation, Ian and Sean Schweitzer, along with Pauling, were indicted and subsequently convicted based on Pauling's testimony and the accounts of other jailhouse informants. The prosecution's case heavily relied on the statements made by Pauling and additional testimonies from jailhouse informants, rather than solid physical evidence. The intense pressure to resolve the high-profile case likely contributed to the reliance on these testimonies, despite their questionable reliability. In 2000, Ian Schweitzer was convicted and sentenced to 130 years in prison for second-degree slaying, kidnapping, and sexual assault. Frank Pauling Jr. received life sentences for his supposed role in the crime. Sean Schweitzer eventually accepted a plea deal, which included a reduced sentence in exchange for a guilty plea and a statement against his brother Ian. Despite the convictions, questions about the integrity of the investigation and the reliability of the testimonies lingered. The breakthrough in the Dana Ireland case came with advancements in DNA testing technology, which offered a glimmer of hope in resolving lingering doubts about the guilt of Ian Schweitzer, Sean Schweitzer, and Frank Pauling Jr. After their convictions, the Hawaii Innocence Project, along with the New York Innocence Project, began advocating for a re-examination of the evidence using new DNA testing methods. Key pieces of evidence were retested, including a Jimmy's t-shirt found near Dana's body, which had been soaked in her blood. During the original trials, this t-shirt was a crucial piece of evidence used by the prosecution to link the accused to the crime. Witnesses had claimed that the shirt belonged to Frank Pauling Jr., despite his denials. However, the new DNA tests revealed that the DNA on the t-shirt did not match any of the three convicted men. Instead, it pointed to an unknown male referred to as Unknown Male Number 1. Furthermore, additional items from Donna Ireland's sexual assault kit were also retested. The results once again excluded Ian Schweitzer, Sean Schweitzer, and Frank Pauling Jr., and pointed to the same unidentified male. This compelling new evidence strongly suggested that none of the convicted men were involved in the crime, and that the real perpetrator had not been identified. Armed with this new DNA evidence, the legal teams representing Ian Schweitzer filed petitions to overturn his conviction. The court hearings featured expert testimony on the DNA results, which clearly demonstrated the innocence of the convicted men. After a thorough review, a judge vacated Ian Schweitzer's conviction in January 2023, leading to his immediate release from prison after more than 2 decades behind bars. Upon his release, Ian Schweitzer experienced a whirlwind of emotions, ranging from relief and gratitude to frustration and a renewed sense of purpose. Speaking publicly, he emphasized his deep appreciation for the efforts of the Hawaii Innocence Project and the New York Innocence Project, whose relentless advocacy and expertise in DNA testing were instrumental in securing his exoneration. Schweitzer's reflections on his wrongful conviction highlighted the severe flaws in the criminal justice system that led to his 23-year imprisonment. He expressed a profound sense of loss, comparing his wrongful conviction to the very crimes he was accused of. "I feel like they butchered 25 years of my life. I feel like they kidnapped me away from my family. I feel like they raided me of being a son," he stated. Despite his exoneration, Schweitzer remains acutely aware that justice for Dana Ireland has not been fully served. The real perpetrator, identified only as unknown male number 1 through DNA evidence, was still at large. This unresolved aspect of the case fuels Schweitzer's ongoing quest for justice. He expressed a desire to continue advocating for the use of advanced forensic techniques to identify the true attacker and bring closure to Dana Ireland's family. Finally, in July 2024, the authorities uncovered the identity of unknown male number 1, Albert Lauro Jr., a 57-year-old resident of Kapoho, Hawaii. Lauro, who lived near the location where Ireland was attacked, had never been on the police radar throughout the decades-long investigation. The breakthrough came after DNA collected from Lauro's discarded utensil matched the DNA found at the crime scene, known as unknown male number 1. Further confirmation was obtained through a court-ordered buccal swab. Despite this critical match, police initially did not have sufficient evidence to arrest Lauro immediately for taking a life. Shortly after providing the DNA sample, Lauro committed suicide on July 29, 2024. He was found dead in his home, leading to further scrutiny of the police's handling of the investigation. This tragic turn of events occurred just days after his DNA was confirmed to match the evidence found at the crime scene. Despite Lauro's death, the investigation into the Dana Ireland case is far from over. Authorities are now examining Lauro's past and potential motives, as well as any connections he might have had to the crime scene. The ongoing efforts aim to bring full closure to the case and ensure that all unanswered questions are addressed. Sarah Ann Geer, a 13-year-old girl from Cloverdale, California, was a typical teenager in her community. She was known for her friendly demeanor and had a circle of friends who shared similar interests. On the morning of May 24, 1982, her life was tragically cut short in a brutal crime that would haunt the small town for decades. On that fateful day, Sarah was reported missing by her family after she failed to return home. A search ensued, and later that day, her body was discovered behind a Main Street apartment building in Cloverdale. The scene was horrifying. Sarah had been assaulted, strangled, and left partially clothed. The brutal nature of the crime shocked the local community and left a lasting scar on those who knew her. The initial response from the Cloverdale Police Department was swift. Investigators cordoned off the area and began meticulously collecting evidence. Among the items gathered were physical samples that, at the time, could not be fully analyzed due to the limitations of forensic technology. Despite the police's efforts to canvass the area and interview potential witnesses, no immediate leads emerged. The impact of Sarah's passing on the community was profound. Her friends and family were devastated, grappling with the sudden and violent loss of a beloved daughter and friend. The town, known for its quiet and safe atmosphere, was gripped by fear and sorrow. For nearly 40 years, Sarah Ann Geer's case remained unsolved. In 2021, nearly 40 years after Sarah's tragic death, the Cloverdale Police Department, driven by a renewed commitment to solving the case, decided to reopen the investigation. Equipped with modern forensic techniques, they meticulously re-examined the evidence. This renewed effort would soon lead to a breakthrough that would change everything. Determined to bring justice to Sarah and her family, the Cloverdale Police Department contracted with a private investigation firm specializing in cold cases. This firm brought in experts equipped with the latest technological advancements, allowing for a fresh examination of the preserved evidence. The collaboration aimed to offer new perspectives or uncover previously overlooked details that could lead to identifying the perpetrator. A critical step in the reopened investigation was the re-examination of the physical evidence collected at the crime scene, including the DNA samples that had been meticulously preserved over the years. With modern DNA analysis techniques, investigators were able to extract and profile the DNA more accurately and comprehensively than was possible in the 1980s. The breakthrough in the case came when the DNA evidence was processed using genetic genealogy technology. This method involves comparing the DNA profile obtained from the crime scene with profiles in genealogical databases. By identifying relatives of the suspect through their DNA, investigators could significantly narrow down the pool of potential suspects. The process was meticulous and required extensive cross-referencing and validation. Investigators built family trees and eliminated individuals who could not have been involved due to factors such as age or location at the time of the crime. This painstaking work eventually paid off in 2021 and led them to James Unick, a 62-year-old man living in Willows, California. James Unick had a history in Cloverdale, which added another layer of complexity to the investigation. In 1985, just 3 years after Sarah's demise, Unick was involved in a hit-and-run incident in Cloverdale. During this incident, he led police on a high-speed chase before eventually being apprehended. Although it was not clear if records from this event directly contributed to identifying him as a suspect in Sarah's case, it demonstrated his familiarity with the area and his potential for violent behavior. Upon identifying Unick as a potential suspect, investigators needed to build a solid case. This involved corroborating the DNA evidence with other findings from the original investigation and any new information that had come to light. The comprehensive review included interviews with individuals who had known Unick and re-evaluating all the evidence in the context of this new lead. In July 2021, the Cloverdale Police Department announced a major breakthrough. James Unick was arrested and charged with the slaying, assault, kidnapping, and lewd and lascivious acts with a minor under 14 by force. The arrest was a pivotal moment, not only for the investigation but also for Sarah's family and the community of Cloverdale, who had waited nearly 40 years for justice. The news of Unick's arrest was met with a mix of relief and sorrow. While it offered a sense of closure, it also brought back the pain and grief of Sarah's brutal slaying. Community members and officials alike expressed their gratitude to the police and forensic experts for their unwavering dedication to solving the case. Cloverdale Police Chief Chris Parker stated that the arrest represented a bittersweet victory for justice, acknowledging the enduring pain of the Gear family while offering solace in the perpetrator's accountability. James Unick, now facing charges for one of Cloverdale's most notorious cold cases, is held without bail in the Sonoma County Jail. As of 2024, the legal proceedings are underway. The Sonoma County Court has scheduled various hearings, including preliminary hearings and status conferences. As the case progresses through the judicial system, the trial's outcome is awaited with high anticipation, and it is expected to bring some measure of closure to the community. Mary Catherine Edwards was a vibrant and respected school teacher living in Beaumont, Texas. At 31 years old, she was deeply loved by her family, friends, and students. Known for her dedication and warmth, Mary Catherine had recently moved into a new townhouse and was looking forward to the future. Her life, however, was tragically cut short in January 1995. On the evening of January 13, 1995, Mary Catherine was last seen by her acquaintances. When she failed to respond to phone calls the next day, her parents grew concerned. They decided to visit her home on Park Meadow Street to check on her welfare. What they found was a scene of horror that would haunt them and the community for decades. Mary Catherine Edwards was discovered lifeless in her bathroom. She had been sexually assaulted and slain, with her hands handcuffed behind her back. The cause of death was determined to be drowning. This brutal crime left her family and friends devastated and the community in shock. The initial investigation by the Beaumont Police Department and the Texas Rangers was exhaustive. The crime scene was meticulously examined for any evidence that could lead to the identification of the perpetrator. Forensic experts collected various samples, including DNA, from the scene. These samples were crucial, but, given the technology of the mid-1990s, they provided limited immediate leads. Nevertheless, they were preserved in the hope that future advancements might one day solve the case. Mary Katherine's friends, family, and colleagues were interviewed extensively to construct a timeline of her final hours. Investigators learned that Mary Katherine had a wide circle of friends and no known enemies, making it difficult to pinpoint any potential suspects. The initial theory was that the crime could have been committed by someone she knew, given the lack of forced entry and the brutality of the assault. The community of Beaumont was left in shock and fear, knowing that a brutal killer was still at large. Mary Katherine's demise cast a long shadow over the town, and her family was left to mourn without closure. The police continued to follow up on any new information that came in, but the trail remained cold for decades. As the years went by, the case of Mary Katherine Edwards' slaying seemed destined to remain unsolved. However, the relentless efforts of investigators and significant advancements in forensic technology eventually provided a breakthrough. By 2010, the emergence of genetic genealogy opened new possibilities for solving cold cases. Genetic genealogy involves using DNA testing combined with traditional genealogical methods to identify suspects through their family trees. This technique became instrumental in solving numerous cold cases, and Mary Katherine's case was no exception. In 2021, Beaumont Police and the Texas Rangers decided to revisit the case with the assistance of Othram, a company specializing in forensic-grade genome sequencing. This company had the capability to analyze degraded or small amounts of DNA that had been preserved from the crime scene. Othram's analysis led to a significant development, a DNA profile that could be compared against genetic databases. Investigators led by Detective Tina Llewellyn, who had spent countless hours working on the case in her spare time, began constructing a family tree from the DNA profile. This complex process involved identifying over 7,400 individuals, including relatives dating back to the 1800s. Eventually, the search was narrowed down to two brothers from Beaumont, one of whom was Clayton Bernard Foreman. Foreman had been a high school classmate of Mary Katherine Edwards at Forest Park High School. This connection, combined with the DNA evidence, made him a prime suspect. To confirm their suspicions, FBI agents conducted a trash pull at Foreman's residence in Ohio, where he had been living. They collected items such as plastic spoons, hair samples, and medicine bottles, with Foreman's DNA on them. The DNA from these items matched the DNA found at the crime scene, providing the crucial link needed to charge him with the crime. On April 29, 2021, Foreman, then 61 years old, was arrested at his home in Franklin County, Ohio. This arrest came after a meticulous investigation that had spanned over 26 years. Foreman was soon extradited to Jefferson County, Texas, where he faced charges for the assault and slaying of Mary Katherine Edwards. The trial of Clayton Foreman began in earnest, with the prosecution presenting a robust case built on the newly obtained DNA evidence. Jurors were introduced to the science behind genetic genealogy, learning how investigators had used this cutting-edge technique to link Foreman to the crime scene. The prosecution detailed how DNA samples collected from the crime scene in 1995 were matched with DNA obtained from Foreman's discarded items during the trash pull in Ohio. During the trial, Beaumont Police Detective Tina Llewellyn and her team described their painstaking work in constructing a family tree from the DNA profile, ultimately narrowing it down to Foreman. Genetic genealogist Cheryl LaPointe testified about the process and its significance in solving the case. Jurors also heard emotional testimonies from Mary Katherine Edwards' family, including her twin sister. The defense attempted to challenge the DNA evidence and the methods used to obtain it. but their efforts were largely unsuccessful. The judge allowed the DNA evidence to be presented, and it became a cornerstone of the prosecution's case. Following that, the prosecution further presented chilling details about his past, highlighting similarities between Mary Katharine's slaying and a previous sexual assault case involving Foreman. This information played a crucial role in painting a picture of a man with a history of violent behavior, which significantly bolstered the prosecution's case. In 1981, Foreman was involved in a sexual assault case that bore striking resemblances to the slaying of Mary Katharine Edwards. In this earlier case, Foreman was accused of sexually assaulting a woman in a manner that had disturbing parallels to Mary Katharine's case. Both incidents involved a brutal sexual assault, and in both cases, the victims were left in vulnerable positions. These similarities suggested a pattern of behavior that was consistent with Foreman's actions in the 1995 slaying of Mary Katharine Edwards. The revelation of Foreman's violent past, combined with the DNA evidence linking him to the crime scene, created a compelling narrative for the jury. Therefore, on June 30, 2024, the jury found Clayton Bernard Foreman guilty of taking a life. Although the death penalty was not pursued, Foreman was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. This verdict brought a long-awaited sense of closure to Mary Katharine Edwards' family and friends, ending a nearly 3-decade-long pursuit of justice. Today, Mary is remembered not only as a dedicated teacher and cherished member of her community, but also as a symbol of the enduring quest for justice. Her case, once a haunting mystery, now stands as a beacon of what can be achieved through the relentless pursuit of truth and the remarkable capabilities of modern forensic science. In the quiet town of Mound City, Missouri, Peggy Horsemen, a 27-year-old woman, was working the night shift as a clerk at the King Oil Station on September 27, 1985. The King Oil Station was located in an isolated spot off Interstate 29, making it difficult to spot from the road. The surveillance equipment at the store was not operational at the time, adding to the challenges investigators would face. Around 3:30 a.m. on that fateful night, Peggy spoke with her employer, Mrs. Alexis Whittam. This was the last known interaction she had before the tragic event. Shortly after, an area motorist discovered Peggy's lifeless body inside the store. She had been shot in the back of the head at close range with a 16-gauge shotgun. Her body was partially in a beverage cooler, indicating she might have been trying to escape or hide. The initial investigation was led by local law enforcement with the assistance of the Holt County Sheriff's Office. The crime scene was meticulously examined, revealing critical but limited physical evidence. The shotgun shell casing found near Peggy's body was one of the few tangible pieces of evidence. However, the absence of operational surveillance cameras and the secluded location of the King Oil Station posed significant challenges. Investigators interviewed potential witnesses and nearby residents, hoping to find someone who might have seen or heard something unusual. Among them was Peggy Horsemen's employer, Mrs. Alexis Whittam, as well. This conversation took place around 3:30 a.m., shortly before Peggy was killed. Investigators also looked into Peggy's personal life, questioning family members, friends, and acquaintances to determine if there were any potential leads or motives. Rumors and speculations circulated within the community, but none led to concrete evidence or suspects. The investigators faced a tough task as they tried to piece together the events leading up to Peggy's murder. The turning point in Peggy Horsemen's case came in November 2022, when Holt County Sheriff Steve Portman hired Captain Terry Horner to reinvestigate the cold case along with other unresolved crimes in the county. Captain Horner brought fresh eyes and modern forensic techniques to the investigation, which had been stagnant for nearly 39 years. Horner's approach included a thorough re-examination of the physical evidence collected from the original crime scene. Advances in forensic technology since 1985 allowed for more sophisticated analyses that were not available to the original investigators. This included the retesting of the shotgun shell casing and other trace evidence. Captain Horner also conducted extensive interviews, revisiting witnesses who had previously been questioned and identifying new individuals who might have information. He spent countless hours reviewing old case files, reassessing alibis, and cross-referencing details that had been overlooked or dismissed in the initial investigation. One of the significant developments came from these renewed interviews and the careful re-examination of witness statements. Horner identified inconsistencies and gaps that pointed toward Kirby G. David, a resident of Oregon, Missouri, who had a history of criminal activity. David, born in 1962, was already incarcerated in the Missouri Department of Corrections for a felony charge unrelated to Peggy's murder. On March 17, 2020, David had started serving a 20-year sentence for the distribution of a controlled substance in a protected location. His criminal record and proximity to Mound City at the time of Peggy's murder placed him under suspicion. Further investigation revealed more compelling evidence linking him to the crime. Additionally, new testimonies from witnesses, who had either not been interviewed before or had come forward with new information, further solidified the case against David. Witnesses recalled seeing a man matching David's description near the King oil station around the time of Peggy's murder. Some remembered hearing rumors about David's involvement, but had not come forward earlier due to fear or uncertainty. Horner's persistent questioning and assurance of their safety encouraged these individuals to provide crucial details that had been missing for decades. Furthermore, Horner's reevaluation of David's criminal history showed a pattern of violent behavior and previous run-ins with the law that made him a viable suspect. David's proximity to Mound City at the time of the murder and his subsequent criminal activities painted a clearer picture of his potential involvement in the crime. The culmination of these efforts led Captain Horner to present his findings to the Holt County prosecuting attorney. By mid-2024, Horner's persistent efforts bore fruit. The evidence gathered was compelling enough for the Holt County prosecuting attorney to file a charge of first-degree murder against Kirby G. David. On July 31, 2024, the charge was formally announced. The nearly 39-year wait for justice for Peggy Horsemen appeared to be nearing an end. The announcement was made public, bringing a mixture of relief and anticipation to the community of Mound City. It was a significant milestone, not only for Peggy's family and friends, but also for the broader community that had been haunted by the unsolved murder for so many years. If you find this video compelling, show your support by giving it a thumbs up, subscribing to our channel, and ringing that notification bell. By doing so, you'll stay updated about the latest investigations and mysteries. Your support means the world to us as we continue to pursue the truth in the world of cold cases.